Wednesday, December 21. The Executive Judgment. During the Middle Ages, there was a strong tendency to portray God as a severe, punitive judge. Today, the tendency is to describe him as a loving, permissive father who never punishes his children. Yet, love without justice will turn into chaos and lawlessness, and justice without love will become oppression and subjugation. God's judging process is a perfect blend of justice and mercy, both of which derive from his unconditional love. The executive judgment is God's final and irreversible punitive intervention in human history. Limited punitive judgments occurred, for example, in the casting out of Satan and his rebellious angels from heaven, recorded in Revelation 12, the driving out of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden in Genesis chapter 3, the Great Flood of Genesis chapter 6 and 7 and 8, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 9 and Jude verse 7, the death of the firstborn in Egypt in Exodus 11 and Exodus 12, and the deaths of Ananias and Sapphira in Acts chapter 5. So it is no surprise that there also will be an executive judgment of the wicked at the end of human history. Read 2 Peter chapter 2 verses 4 to 6 and 2 Peter chapter 3 verses 10 to 13. How do these texts help us understand the nature of the final executive judgment? How does that imply the idea of the completion of judgment as opposed to its going on forever, which would be a perversion of justice and not an expression of it? 2 Peter chapter 2, beginning at verse 4, "For if God did not spare the angels who sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved for judgment, and did not spare the ancient world, but saved Noah, one of the 8 people, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood on the world of the ungodly, and turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them to destruction, making them an example to those who afterward would live ungodly." And 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 10 to 13. "But the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens will pass away with a great noise, and the elements will melt with fervent heat, both the earth and the works that are in it will be burned up. Therefore, since all these things will be dissolved, what manner of persons ought you to be in holy conduct and godliness, looking for and hasting the coming of the day of God, because of which the heavens will be dissolved, being on fire, and the elements will melt with fervent heat? Nevertheless, we, according to his promise, look for new heavens and a new earth, in which righteousness dwells." God's goodness, Ellen White writes in Manuscript Releases, Volume 12, page 208, and long forbearance, his patience and mercy exercised to his subjects, will not hinder him from punishing the sinner who refused to be obedient to his requirements. It is not for a man, a criminal against God's holy law, pardoned only through the great sacrifice he made in giving his Son to die for the guilty because his law was changeless, to dictate to God. End of quote. All that God could have done to save humanity from being eternally lost, he did, even at a great cost to himself. Those who are lost ultimately made choices that led them to this unfortunate end. The idea that God's judgment on the lost, even the annihilation of the lost as opposed to eternal torment, goes against the character of a loving God is simply wrong. It's God's love and God's love alone that demands justice as well. And so to finish today, what does the cross itself teach us about what God was willing to do in order to save everyone who would be saved? This lesson was read by Dr. Percy Harrold for Christian Services for the Blind, sponsored by the Sabbath School Department and distributed through Hope Channel Australia This podcast is also redistributed by Hope Channel Germany, Christian Record Services for the Blind. It is also available on SoundCloud and through multiple podcast distributors, including Apple iTunes. And you can listen and watch at the same time on YouTube. Remember, God is always faithful.